You think because you walked in here with those scuffed boots and that cheap attitude, you can disrespect my courtroom? Judge King sneered, her gavel slamming down like a gunshot. I eat boys like you for breakfast. You're nothing but a statistic, Mr. Turner. 30 days in county. She laughed, the sound dripping with elitist venom, completely unaware of the earpiece hidden beneath his collar. She thought she was humiliating a helpless, low-level thug. She had no idea she just threatened the lead FBI agent, dismantling her entire criminal empire. The heavy, brass-studded oak doors of Courtroom 4B swung shut with a resounding thud, sealing the airless room in a tense, suffocating silence. Inside, the walls were lined with dark mahogany paneling that seemed to absorb the meager light, creating an atmosphere of institutional dread. High above the gallery, perched like a vulture on a leather-backed throne, sat Judge Latoya King. She was a woman who had spent the last decade cultivating an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. Her judicial robes were impeccably pressed, draped over a tailored designer suit that whispered of wealth far beyond a state judge's public salary. Before her stood Jason Turner. To the casual observer, Jason was exactly the kind of defendant who cycled through this courthouse 100 times a week. He wore a faded, oversized gray hoodie with frayed cuffs, a pair of worn-out work boots scuffed white at the toes, and jeans that had seen better days. His shoulders were slumped in a posture of defeated submission, his eyes cast downward toward the scuffed linoleum floor. He looked like a man who had been beaten down by the system, a man who had entirely given up hope. But Jason Turner was not defeated. Behind his lowered eyes, his mind was operating with the precise, calculating speed of a supercomputer. Jason Turner, Judge King drawled, her voice amplified by the microphone, dripping with a potent mixture of boredom and venom. She adjusted her reading glasses, looking down her nose at the docket before her. Driving on a suspended license. Outstanding court fees totaling $3,400. And a failure to appear at your last compliance hearing. She let the silence hang, allowing the weight of the courtroom to press down on him. The gallery behind Jason was full of other defendants, all holding their breath, thanking whatever god they prayed to that they weren't the ones currently standing in Latoya King's crosshairs. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Turner? She asked, leaning forward. Or are you just going to stand there and mumble like the rest of the degenerates who dragged their muddy boots into my courtroom? Jason shifted his weight nervously, a calculated movement. He cleared his throat, his voice coming out raspy and timid. Your Honor, I lost my job at the warehouse. I've been trying to get the money together, but the late fees keep stacking up. I just need a little more time, please. Judge King let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter. It echoed off the high ceilings. Time? You want time? Let me tell you something about time, Mr. Turner. Time is a luxury afforded to contributing members of society. You are not a contributing member, you are a drain. You are exactly the kind of statistic that holds this city back. She pointed a manicured finger at him, her eyes flashing with elitist disdain. She was a black woman who had fought her way to the top of the legal food chain, and she had developed a deep, pathological hatred for those she felt perpetuated the stereotypes she had worked so hard to escape. But her supposed righteousness was a mask for something far more sinister. I see young men like you every single day, King continued, her voice rising in theatrical cadence. No ambition. No respect for the law. You think the rules don't apply to you. You think you can just ignore a court order because you're having a hard time? She sneered the last two words. I am sick and tired of the excuses. I don't care about your warehouse job. I don't care about your sob story. Your Honor, if you just give me 30 days, Jason started, playing his part to perfection. Interrupt me again, and I will hold you in contempt right here, right now, King roared, slamming her gavel. You will not speak unless spoken to. You are nothing in this room. You are a speck of dirt on the scales of justice. The bailiff, a burly man named Higgins who was well versed in the judge's cruel theatrics, smirked and stepped closer to Jason, hand resting casually on his utility belt. I am assigning you to Liberty Sentinel Services for immediate probation monitoring, Judge King declared, scribbling violently on the file. You will pay them a $200 initiation fee by Friday, and you will pay an additional $150 a week for your ankle monitor and drug testing. If you miss a single payment, you will serve 90 days in the county jail. Do you understand me? I can't afford that, Your Honor, Jason whispered, injecting a tremor of genuine-sounding desperation into his voice. That's more than I was paying before. How am I supposed to eat? That sounds like a personal problem, Mr. Turner, King replied coldly, a wicked smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Maybe you should have thought about your diet before you broke the law. Get him out of my sight. As the bailiff grabbed Jason roughly by the arm and shoved him toward the heavy oak doors, the gallery remained dead silent. Judge King smoothed her robes, entirely satisfied with her morning's work. She had humiliated another victim, asserting her absolute dominance. But as Jason stumbled out into the fluorescent-lit hallway, away from the judge's line of sight, the facade of the broken man instantly vanished. His slumped shoulders squared. His breathing steadied. He reached up to adjust the thick-rimmed, cheap-looking glasses on his face. Built into the hinge of the right frame was a state-of-the-art, high-definition microcamera. Beneath the collar of his frayed hoodie was a discreet, military-grade microphone. Jason Turner wasn't a warehouse worker. And he definitely wasn't a statistic. He had just successfully recorded exactly what he came for, and Judge LaToya King had no idea she had just handed a loaded gun to the man who was going to destroy her life. 2 hours later, Jason walked through the towering, imposing brutalist architecture of the J. Edgar Hoover Building in downtown Washington, D.C. The transition from the dingy municipal courthouse to the nerve center of federal law enforcement was always a jarring experience, but today, Jason felt a surge of cold, focused energy. He swiped his credentials at the security turnstile, bypassing the metal detectors, and took the elevator up to the restricted floors housing the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. When he pushed open the glass doors of the squad room, the chaotic hum of ringing phones, clicking keyboards, and low-level chatter washed over him. He walked straight to the back of the room, past rows of cubicles, and entered a large, glass-walled conference room. Special Agent Sarah Jenkins, a brilliant forensic accountant with a mind like a steel trap, looked up from a mountain of financial ledgers. Next to her was Agent Mike Reyes, a veteran investigator who had spent 10 years working organized crime before moving to the corruption squad. "Tell me you got it," Reyes said, leaning back in his chair and tossing a pen onto the table. Jason didn't say a word. He unzipped his ragged hoodie, pulled a small encrypted flash drive from a concealed pocket inside his undershirt, and tossed it onto the polished conference table. "I got it. Every arrogant, constitutional rights violating second of it." Jenkins snatched the drive and plugged it into a secure laptop. Within seconds, the high-definition footage from Jason's glasses filled the large monitor mounted on the wall. The audio of Judge King's vicious tirade echoed through the room. "You are a drain. You are exactly the kind of statistic that holds this city back." Reyes let out a low whistle. "Man, she is piece of work. I've seen cartel bosses with more empathy. She's not just mean, Mike. She's methodical," Jason said, grabbing a dry erase marker and walking over to the massive whiteboard that dominated one side of the room. The board was covered in photographs, flowcharts, and banking wire transfers. Right in the center was a large 8x10 glossy photo of Judge LaToya King. "Operation Gavel Strike is finally hitting the final phase," Jason continued, drawing a thick red line from King's photo to a corporate logo pinned on the board, Liberty Sentinel Services. For 8 months, Jason and his team had been quietly investigating a massive judicial kickback scheme. It was a modern-day extortion racket masquerading as justice. Judge King was systematically targeting low-income defendants, predominantly minorities, who were brought in for minor, non-violent offenses, traffic tickets, loitering, petty possession. Instead of handing down standard community service or reasonable fines based on their income, she would intentionally inflate their fines to impossible numbers. When the defendants inevitably couldn't pay, she would offer them a lifeline, private probation through Liberty Sentinel Services. "Look at the numbers," Jenkins chimed in, bringing up a spreadsheet on the monitor. Liberty Sentinel charges a $200 intake fee, plus $150 a week for monitoring. They charge the defendants for the drug tests, for the ankle bracelets, even for the paperwork. If a defendant falls behind on payments, Liberty reports them to Judge King for a probation violation, and King throws them in the county jail. Reyes finished the thought, shaking his head in disgust, creating an endless cycle of debt and incarceration. Exactly, Jason said, his voice hard. But it doesn't stop there. We know Liberty Sentinel is a shell. It's owned by Arthur Vance. Jason tapped a photo of a slick, wealthy-looking man in his 50s. And Vance is kicking back 25% of those exorbitant probation fees directly to Judge King through offshore shell companies in the Caymans. Jason stared at the photo of the judge. He had spent his entire career putting away dirty politicians, corrupt police chiefs, and crooked judges. To him, there was no worse criminal than one who wore a badge or a robe. They used the sacred trust of the public to line their own pockets, destroying generations of families in the process. Being in that courtroom today, playing the role of the helpless victim, had taken everything in him to maintain his composure. When she looked down at him and called him a statistic, he had felt a burning flash of anger. He remembered his own uncle, a good man who had been caught in a similar predatory probation trap years ago, losing his house and his family because of a minor traffic violation he couldn't afford to pay off. She thinks she's untouchable, Jason murmured, almost to himself. She is legally very well insulated, Jenkins warned, pushing her glasses up her nose. The wire transfers to the Cayman accounts are obfuscated through 3 different LLCs. We have circumstantial financial evidence, but any high-priced defense lawyer could argue Vance is paying consulting fees to an entity she doesn't directly control. We need the smoking gun. We need her on tape explicitly connecting the harsh sentences to the financial payouts. Which is exactly why I'm going back in, Jason said, turning to his team. Today was just setting the hook. I played the pathetic, broken defendant. I pleaded poverty. I showed her my neck, and she bit. She ordered me to pay Liberty Sentinel. What's the next move, boss? Reyes asked. Friday, Jason replied, his eyes narrowing. Friday is my compliance check. I'm going to walk into that courtroom and tell her I didn't pay the fee to Vance's company. I'm going to push her buttons until she completely loses her temper. We know she meets with Arthur Vance every Friday night to discuss the week's yield. We push her in the courtroom, she'll complain to Vance at dinner. And we'll be listening, Jenkins smiled. Jason nodded. We get her admitting to the scheme on audio, and we bring the whole hammer of the federal government down on her head. Judge King wants to talk about statistics? By next week, she's going to be inmate number 84729. Friday morning arrived with a bleak, oppressive drizzle that seemed to perfectly match the mood inside the municipal courthouse. Jason Turner returned to courtroom 4B, looking even more disheveled than his previous appearance. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. He wore a faded, stained flannel shirt, and he had intentionally smudged dirt into the creases of his hands. He needed to look desperate. He needed to look entirely devoid of agency. Judge LaToya King was already in a foul mood. The docket was long, and she was moving through cases with ruthless efficiency, handing out maximum fines and private probation sentences like she was dealing cards at a casino. When the bailiff called Jason's name, Jason shuffled slowly to the defense podium. He kept his head down, staring at the grain of the wood, letting the silence stretch out to deliberately agitate the judge. Mr. Turner, King snapped, her voice cracking like a whip across the room, I see you've decided to grace us with your presence. Do you have the compliance paperwork from Liberty Sentinel Services? Jason took a slow, deep breath, activating the hidden camera in his glasses. No, Your Honor. I couldn't get the money together. My landlord threatened to evict me. I had to pay the rent. I tried to tell the people at Liberty, but they told me if I didn't have the $200 in cash, they wouldn't even let me in the building. Judge King's face hardened into a mask of pure contempt. She leaned back in her leather chair, steepling her fingers. You paid your rent. Yes, ma'am. I didn't want to be on the street. So, let me ensure I understand the hierarchy of your priorities, Mr. Turner, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet volume that forced the entire courtroom to strain to hear her. You decided that your comfort was more important than a direct order from a court of law. You decided that your personal living arrangements supersede the justice system. I just needed a few more days. Quiet, she roared, her sudden volume making several people in the gallery jump. You do not dictate the schedule of this court. You were given a chance. A generous chance to take responsibility for your pathetic life, and you spat in the face of this court. Jason stood his ground, letting the verbal abuse wash over him, his internal focus entirely on the recording. Keep going, he thought. Dig the hole deeper, Your Honor. I am sick of dealing with people who refuse to be accountable, she sneered, looking at Jason with visceral disgust. You want to play the victim? Fine. Let's see how much of a victim you feel like in lockup. Bailiff, take Mr. Turner into holding. He can sit in a cell and think about his priorities until I decide what to do with him. Higgins, the oversized bailiff, practically leapt at the opportunity. He grabbed Jason by the bicep, twisting his arm slightly to assert dominance, and marched him toward the heavy side door that led to the temporary holding cells behind the courtroom. The holding area was a stark, depressing corridor lined with concrete cells, smelling intensely of bleach and stale sweat. Higgins shoved Jason into a cell, slamming the iron bars shut with a deafening clang. Sit tight, tough guy, Higgins sneered. She's gonna throw the book at you. Jason sat on the cold steel bench, waiting for the bailiff's footsteps to fade away. The moment he was alone, his demeanor shifted instantly. He wasn't a scared civilian, he was an apex predator in his element. He reached into the thick sole of his left boot and carefully extracted a tiny, coin-sized object. It was a military-grade, high-sensitivity audio bug. He knew from intel that Judge King frequently used the holding cell corridor as a private passageway to her chambers, often conducting off-the-record conversations with court staff away from the prying eyes of the public. Jason quickly slipped his hand through the bars, reaching as far down the outer concrete wall as he could, and pressed the magnetic bug against the underside of an exposed heating pipe. He retreated to the bench and waited. 30 minutes later, the heavy door at the end of the hall opened. He heard the distinct click-clack of Judge King's designer heels. She wasn't alone. I don't care how you process them, Higgins, just make sure the paperwork for liberty is expedited, King's voice echoed softly down the corridor. Yes, Judge, the bailiff replied. What about the Turner kid? Let him rot back here until the end of the day, she scoffed. He needs to understand who holds his leash. When I bring him back out, I'm going to threaten him with 6 months in county. That usually scares the money out of them. He'll find the 200 for liberty by Monday. They always find the money when they smell the jail cell. Jason smiled grimly in the shadows. He had it. A direct admission of using the threat of incarceration to extort money for a private company, but it wasn't enough to secure a federal conviction. He still needed to tie her directly to Arthur Vance and the offshore kickbacks. At 4 p.m., Jason was brought back into the courtroom. True to her word, Judge King played her cruel game. She threatened him with 6 months behind bars, raising her voice, making a terrifying spectacle of him. Finally, she offered her mercy. I will give you until Monday morning, Mr. Turner, she declared, her eyes cold and merciless. If you do not have proof of enrollment with Liberty Sentinel by 9 a.m. Monday, you will be taken directly to the county penitentiary. Get out. Jason nodded submissively and hurried out of the courtroom. The trap was set. Now, all he had to do was wait for her to celebrate her week's earnings. Washington, D.C. at night is a city of secrets, deals, and hidden power. The Capitol Grill on Pennsylvania Avenue was exactly the kind of establishment where those deals were made over dry-aged steaks and $1,000 bottles of Cabernet. It was a world of dark mahogany, soft amber lighting, and discreet waiters who knew how to turn a blind eye. In a dimly lit surveillance van parked strategically near a loading dock 2 streets over, Jason Turner sat with a pair of heavy headphones clamped over his ears. He was dressed in black tactical gear, a stark contrast to the ragged clothes he had worn hours earlier. Next to him, Agent Jenkins was monitoring an array of audio equalizers, while Reyes kept an eye on a cluster of live video feeds. Target is seated at table 4, Reyes announced, pointing to a grainy feed coming from a tiny camera hidden in a flower arrangement on a nearby booth. The camera had been planted by an FBI tech, posing as a busboy an hour earlier. On the screen, Judge LaToya King looked nothing like the austere legal authority she projected in court. She wore a stunning crimson silk dress, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She looked like royalty. Sitting across from her was Arthur Vance, the CEO of Liberty Sentinel Services. Vance was a smooth, polished corporate predator, wearing a bespoke suit and a Rolex that cost more than most of King's defendants made in a year. "Audio is live," Jenkins said, fine-tuning a dial. In the van, the ambient noise of the restaurant clinking glasses and muted laughter faded slightly as Jenkins isolated the frequency of the directional mic aimed directly at their table. "Absolutely ridiculous week," Judge King's voice came through, crisp and clear. "The sheer volume of trash coming through my court is exhausting. I had this one today, some pathetic kid named Turner. Tried to give me a sob story about his rent." "They always have a story, LaToya," Vance replied smoothly, taking a sip of wine. "Did you break him?" "Of course I broke him," King laughed, a cold, empty sound. "I threw him in holding for a few hours, threatened him with 6 months in county lockup. He practically wet himself. He'll have your $200 by Monday." Jason's jaw clenched in the dark van. Hearing her recount the humiliation as if it were an amusing anecdote made his blood boil. But he forced his emotions down. He was a professional. He needed the kill shot. "Good," Vance said, cutting into his steak. "We processed 42 new enrollments from your court this week alone. That's a record. Our intake fees are up, and with the weekly monitoring, we're projecting a very healthy Q3. Which brings me to why we are drinking this obscenely expensive wine, Arthur," King said, her tone suddenly shifting from conversational to strictly business. The warmth vanished from her voice. 42 enrollments. "I am flooding your company with clients. I am systematically denying public defenders' motions to reduce fines to ensure they have no choice but to use liberty." In the van, Jason leaned forward, holding his breath. "Say it, say the numbers. I am well aware of your contributions, LaToya. And you are being compensated handsomely for your judicial philosophy," Vance replied cautiously. 25% isn't enough anymore, Arthur," King demanded, her voice hard as steel. "Not for the risks I'm taking. If the Judicial Oversight Board even caught a whiff of this, I'd lose my pension. I want 35% of the gross intake fees, routed through the Belize LLC this time. The Cayman accounts are getting too bloated." Vance sighed, putting down his fork. 35 is steep, LaToya. That cuts into my operating margins. Your operating margins wouldn't exist without me, King fired back, leaning across the table. I hold the keys to the jail. I send them to you, or I send them to a cage. You don't have a business model without my gavel. 35%, Arthur. Or starting Monday, every single defendant gets community service, and Liberty Sentinel dries up in a month. Vance stared at her for a long moment before raising his wine glass in a toast. 35%. Routed to Belize. You drive a hard bargain, Judge. I'm just ensuring justice is served, King smiled, clinking her glass against his. In the surveillance van, Jason slowly pulled his headphones off. He looked at Jenkins, who was staring at her computer screen with a look of absolute triumph. The audio waveform of the conversation was perfectly captured, digitally sealed, and time-stamped. "We have the conspiracy. We have the extortion. We have the financial routing," Jenkins breathed. "It's a textbook violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law." Reyes grinned, racking the slide of his service weapon with a satisfying metallic clack. "So, do we pick her up on her way to the valet?" Jason shook his head, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He remembered the humiliation. He remembered her looking down at him from her elevated bench, calling him dirt, stripping him of his dignity in front of a room full of people. "No," Jason said softly. "She likes making a public spectacle out of people. She likes asserting her power in her courtroom. So, that's exactly where we're going to take it away from her. Monday morning." 8:55 a.m. Courtroom 4B was packed to capacity. Word had spread among the regular attorneys and court staff that Judge King was in one of her notoriously ruthless moods. The air was thick with anxiety as defendants sat rigidly in the wooden pews, praying their names would be called late in the day. Judge King sat on her elevated bench, radiating smug satisfaction. Her weekend had been highly profitable. The deal with Arthur Vance was secured, and her offshore accounts were growing by the day. She felt like a queen surveying her miserable, chaotic kingdom. "Call the next case," she ordered, adjusting her robes. "State versus Jason Turner," the bailiff called out. From the back of the courtroom, a figure stood up. But it wasn't the hunched, terrified warehouse worker from Friday. Jason Turner walked down the center aisle, and with every step he took, the atmosphere in the room fundamentally altered. He was no longer wearing the ragged hoodie or the scuffed boots. Instead, he was dressed in a sharp, perfectly tailored, dark navy Tom Ford suit. A crisp white shirt. A subtly striped tie. His posture was impeccably straight, his shoulders broad, radiating an aura of absolute command and authority that instantly dwarfed the judge's own presence. He walked past the swinging wooden gate and stepped right up to the defense podium. He didn't look down. He looked directly up at Judge King, his eyes locking onto hers with the intensity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. Judge King blinked, momentarily thrown entirely off balance. Her brain struggled to reconcile the image of the broken man she had tormented on Friday with the formidable, powerful man standing before her now. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice faltering for the very first time. She quickly recovered, anger replacing her confusion. "Is this some kind of joke? Did you steal that suit to impress me? I asked for proof of enrollment with Liberty Sentinel, not a fashion show." "I don't have proof of enrollment, LaToya," Jason said. The courtroom gasped collectively. Nobody, absolutely nobody, addressed Judge King by her first name. The bailiff, Higgins, immediately stepped forward, his hand resting on his taser. King's face turned a violent shade of purple. "Excuse me? You will address me as, Your Honor." "Bailiff, take this man into custody immediately for contempt of court. I am giving you a year in the county lockup, Turner, a full year." Higgins reached out to grab Jason's shoulder. Jason didn't even flinch. He didn't look at the bailiff. With a speed that terrified Higgins, Jason's hand shot out, grabbing the bailiff's wrist in a vice-like grip and effortlessly twisting it away. "Stand down, Higgins, unless you want an obstruction of justice charge added to your federal indictment," Jason said, his voice echoing through the dead silent courtroom with the force of a thunderclap. Before Higgins could react, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom burst violently open. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with massive yellow FBI letters printed on the back flooded into the room. They moved with military precision, instantly securing all the exits. Agent Mike Reyes moved swiftly to the bailiff, disarming him and shoving him against the wall. Agent Sarah Jenkins marched directly toward the clerk's desk, holding up a stack of federal warrants. Panic erupted in the gallery, but a sharp command from Reyes ordered everyone to remain seated and silent. Judge King shot up from her leather chair, her hands trembling as she grabbed her gavel. "What is the meaning of this? This is a state courtroom. You have no jurisdiction here. I am a judge." Jason slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, flipped it open, and slammed it down onto the heavy wooden podium. A golden badge caught the fluorescent light, gleaming brightly. "Supervisory Special Agent Jason Turner," he announced, his voice carrying the full, crushing weight of the federal government, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Public Corruption Unit. Judge King froze. The gavel slipped from her trembling fingers and clattered onto the desk. The blood drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The realization hit her like a freight train. The ragged, pathetic defendant she had mocked, the man she had called trash and a statistic, was a highly decorated federal agent who had been hunting her from the inside. You like to talk about statistics, LaToya, Jason said, his voice cold, steady, and utterly merciless as he walked around the podium and approached the bench. Let me give you a few. 42 illegal incarcerations this week. $3 million in extorted kickbacks over the last 2 years. And one recording from the Capitol Grill on Friday night where you demanded 35% of the gross from Arthur Vance to route to your offshore shell company in Belize. King slumped back into her chair, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated panic. No, that's a lie. This is a setup. You entrapped me. Entrapment requires me to coerce you into committing a crime, Jason replied, walking up the short steps to stand right beside her elevated throne. All I did was stand in front of you. Your own greed, your own disgusting arrogance, and your hatred for the people you were sworn to protect did the rest. Jason looked down at her. He thought of his uncle. He thought of every desperate person who had stood where he stood on Friday, begging for mercy and receiving nothing but cruelty. LaToya King, Jason said, his voice ringing out clearly for the entire gallery to hear. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, extortion, racketeering, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The silence in the courtroom was absolute as Jason pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Stand up, he ordered. For a second, it looked like she might resist. The proud, tyrannical judge tried to summon her former authority, glaring up at him, but there was nothing left. The illusion of her power had evaporated, leaving only a corrupt, terrified criminal. Trembling uncontrollably, her legs barely able to support her, LaToya King stood up. Jason grabbed her wrists, pulling them roughly behind her back, and clamped the cold steel around them. The sharp click-click-click of the ratchets echoed in the silent room. Agent Reyes, Jason called out, never taking his eyes off King, take the prisoner out through the front. The front? King gasped, a tear of sheer humiliation finally breaking loose and trailing down her cheek. Jason, please. The media is out there. Don't do this to me. Let me go out the back. Jason leaned in close, his face inches from hers. You humiliated people in front of a gallery for sport. You destroyed lives to buy designer dresses and expensive wine. You wanted to make an example of me? Now, I'm making an example of you. Reyes grabbed her by the arm and marched her down the steps from the bench. As they paraded her down the center aisle, past the gallery of defendants she had terrorized, a spontaneous sound erupted. It started as a low murmur, then swelled into a round of applause. The very people she had called statistics were cheering her downfall. By the time they pushed her through the heavy oak doors and out into the main hallway, local news crews tipped off by the FBI press office were already waiting. The flashes of 100 cameras blinded her as the once untouchable Judge LaToya King was perp-walked in handcuffs, her head bowed in absolute disgrace. The fallout was catastrophic and swift. The federal trial was a media circus, but it was over before it even began. The audio recording from the Capitol Grill was the nail in the coffin. Arthur Vance flipped on her instantly to save himself, providing the FBI with every ledger, every wire transfer, and every hidden account. LaToya King was stripped of her robes, stripped of her law license, and stripped of her massive pension. Every asset she owned, the luxury cars, the townhouse, the offshore accounts, was seized under federal forfeiture laws and redirected into a restitution fund for the victims she had extorted. 6 months later, Jason Turner stood in the visitors' gallery of the Hazleton Federal Correctional Institution. He stood behind a thick wall of reinforced plexiglass, wearing his impeccably tailored suit, his FBI badge clipped to his belt. The heavy steel door on the other side of the glass opened, and a prisoner was led in. She was wearing a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit. Her hair was unkempt, the roots showing gray. She looked 10 years older, hollowed out by the harsh reality of the system she had once ruthlessly commanded. LaToya King sat down, picking up the heavy black telephone receiver. She looked up at Jason through the smudged glass, her eyes filled with a hollow, defeated rage. Jason didn't pick up the phone on his side. He didn't need to hear anything she had to say. He simply looked at her, standing tall, ensuring she saw exactly who had put her in that cage. He looked at the orange jumpsuit. He looked at the scuffed, cheap prison shoes she was forced to wear. She was no longer a judge. She was no longer a queen. She was exactly what she had always despised. She was just a statistic. Jason gave her one final, cold nod, turned his back, and walked out of the prison, leaving her alone with the heavy, ironclad weight of her own karma. Wow, what a massive fall from grace. Judge LaToya King thought she was the untouchable queen of the courtroom, only to be entirely dismantled by the very man she tried to humiliate for her own amusement. It just goes to show, sheer arrogance is always the fastest path to destruction, and true justice often works quietly in the shadows before it steps out to blind you with the light. If you loved this incredible story of hard karma, undercover stings, and sweet revenge, make sure you hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a good underdog story where the corrupt get exactly what they deserve. And if you haven't already, smash